The three-dimensional mass scan of the Boötes void completed at 0347 ship time, and Van Cliff was still staring at the results 6 minutes later when Dr. Reyes found him standing in the dark analytics bay with his coffee going cold in his hand and the display throwing pale blue light across his face in geometric patterns that should not have existed anywhere in the observable universe. "You're supposed to be calibrating the dark matter sensors," Reyes said from the doorway. "Kepler wants the jump calculations finalized by 0600. The scan finished early. Then why do you look like that?" Van Cliff set his coffee cup on the console edge, aligning it precisely with the corner of the panel. The cup's rim caught the blue light and held it. He had been in this bay for 9 hours before the scan completed, running verification loops on the sensor array while the Palamede drifted at station keeping in the absolute dark outside. He was not a man who grew restless during long data runs. He had learned to exist inside extended silence the way certain animals learn to exist inside extended cold, not comfortably, but completely, with full physiological commitment. The silence of the analytics bay was his natural medium. He did not answer her question because he was not certain he had an answer that would make any sense to anyone who had not spent the last 11 months studying gravitational resonance data in the deepest uninhabited region of the known universe. "Close the door," he said. Reyes stepped inside, and the door slid shut behind her. The low hum of the Palamede's hydroponics filtration system filled the silence. That constant subsonic presence the crew called the dead man's breath, steady and reassuring in the way that only things you cannot afford to lose are ever truly reassuring. Van Cliff had once calculated that if the filtration system failed, the ship's atmosphere would become lethally toxic within 48 hours. He had included this calculation in a systems risk assessment that Kepler had filed without comment. The hum was therefore not background noise to Van Cliff. It was a countdown that was not counting down, and the distinction mattered. Van Cliff pulled up the scan overlay and expanded it to fill the main display wall. "What am I looking at?" Reyes said. "Dark matter distribution. Sector Epsilon. It looks like a grid." "Yes," Van Cliff said. "It does." The display showed a three-dimensional volumetric map of the space surrounding the Palamede for approximately 40 light-years in every direction. Standard dark matter distribution in any other region of the universe looked like cosmic foam, irregular, chaotic, webbing between galaxy clusters in the familiar filamentary patterns that cosmological models had been refining for 3 centuries. What the display showed instead was something that Van Cliff had run through 4 separate verification algorithms before allowing himself to look at it directly. Straight lines, perfect right angles, an invisible lattice of dark matter threading through the void in absolute geometric regularity, with each intersection spaced at identical intervals down to a margin of error smaller than his instruments could measure. The structure repeated in every direction without deviation. The blue rendering light made the lines glow like circuit traces on a board the size of everything. And in the spaces between them the scanner showed nothing at all, not the grainy nothing of sensor noise, but a clean, deliberate, architectural nothing. "The scan has an error," Reyes said, her fingers closing around the edge of the console frame as if she needed something fixed to hold. "I ran 4 independent verifications." Van Cliff did not look at her. His eyes stayed on the grid, tracing the lines where they intersected at their impossible right angles. "Then the verification algorithm has an error." "I wrote the verification algorithm." The flatness in his voice was not cruelty. It was the sound of a door closing. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Van Cliff had watched her work for 11 months. She was not stupid and she was not a coward. She was simply being a person, which meant she needed another minute to move from what she saw to what it meant. "How regular?" she finally asked. "The interval between intersections is 7.3 light-years. Every single one. I checked 247 separate intersection points. 7.3 light-years. Exactly. Not approximately. Not within a margin of error. Exactly." Reyes crossed the bay and stood beside him. close enough that he could hear her breathing change as she examined the display. The filtration hum filled the space between them. Outside the port observation slit, the Boötes void was absolutely, perfectly dark. No stars, no galactic structure, nothing but the kind of darkness that made people feel small in a way that stars, paradoxically, never did. Stars were company. This darkness was something else. Van Cliff had spent 11 months outside that slit and had never found a way to describe accurately what it felt like to look at a window that showed you nothing. Not black sky, not empty sky. The absence of sky entirely. Natural formations can exhibit regularity, Reyes said. Not like this. Crystal lattices. Quasi-crystalline. Reyes, look at the scale. She looked at the scale indicator in the lower left corner of the display. Each unit marker was annotated in light years. The lines were not the width of a crystal lattice or even a solar system. They were thousands of light years thick. She stopped talking about natural formations. Van Cliff pulled his tablet from the console slot and navigated to the calculation set he had been working through since the scan completed. His hands were steady. He had always been good at keeping his hands steady, even when his thinking was not calm. And right now his thinking was the furthest from calm it had been since the incident with the mapping error in the Sagittarius arm 18 months ago that had gotten him exiled to this assignment in the first place. I need to show Kepler, Reyes said. Yes. Are you coming? Van Cliff looked at the display. The grid waited in the blue light, perfect and patient and enormous beyond any scale that human intuition was equipped to process. He thought about every conversation he had ever had in front of a display showing an anomaly. He thought about the expression on people's faces when the anomaly was real. I need to run one more calculation first, he said. Tell him I'll have a full data package in 2 hours. Reyes nodded and left. Van Cliff did not watch her go. He was already pulling the mass density readings from the line structure and running the gravitational gradient analysis that he should have run first, but had not, because the implications of the scan had already hit him somewhere behind his sternum like a fist, and he had needed a moment to make his hands steady before he could work. The Palamede was a science vessel, not a luxury cruiser or a military ship, but it was comfortable enough in the way that anything becomes comfortable after 11 months. The amber light from the instrument panels in the common areas was warm and flat, designed by someone who understood that humans working in permanent artificial light needed warmth more than brightness. The crew's personal effects had colonized every horizontal surface. Coffee cups, data tablets in worn protective sleeves, a small cactus that Ensign Moreau had somehow kept alive for 2 years in a grow light no bigger than his fist. There were photographs pinned to the board beside the galley entrance, most of them images of places on Earth or in the habitat systems. Coastlines, mountain ridges, city lights seen from orbit. Van Cliff had no photographs. He had a calibration standard he used to verify his display color accuracy, which he had pinned to the board beside his console because it needed to be somewhere visible and flat, and which the rest of the crew had learned not to comment on. The ship smelled of recycled air and coffee, and the faint metallic undertone that every sealed environment eventually developed. Van Cliff had learned not to notice any of this. He had learned to treat the Palamede the way you treated any tool, functionally, without attachment. He had been sent here because his attention to detail was inconvenient to people who preferred certain anomalies to remain unexamined. He had decided early on that the only reasonable response was to keep examining them. He ran the gravitational gradient analysis. The result came back in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Van Cliff looked at it for a long time without moving. Then he picked up his coffee, found it cold, set it back down, aligned it again with the corner of the panel, and began running the analysis a second time with a different computational approach to confirm that the first result was not a function of his methodology. It was not. He ran it a third time. The same result. The dark matter lines were not symmetric in their gravitational effect. Their density created an asymmetric gradient. Objects approaching from outside the lattice structure experienced standard gravitational influence, small, and easily compensated for. Objects attempting to cross the lines from inside experienced something categorically different. The gradient was not a barrier in the sense of a wall. It was more precise than that. It bent the mathematics of transit in a way that made outward crossing geometrically impossible without achieving velocities that no ship drive in human inventory could produce. Light could enter from outside. Radio waves could enter. Ships could enter. But nothing could exit. Van Cliff sat down on the edge of the console seat and looked at the display for a while. The blue grid lines held their positions on the screen with absolute fidelity. They did not waver or shift or show any of the subtle data rendering artifacts that indicated interpolation or estimation. They were precisely where they were because they were precisely there, and they had been precisely there since before any human instrument had ever tried to measure this region of space, which was a long time. He thought about the 47 anomalous entries he had flagged in the official gravitational maps over the past 3 years. He thought about the review board's dismissal of each one as instrument error or data artifact or operator misinterpretation. He thought about the 2 subsequent reassignments he had received, each further from inhabited space, each framed as an opportunity for independent research in low-interference environments. He had understood what those reassignments meant. He had taken them anyway because the anomalies were real and someone had to look at them. He picked up his tablet and walked down the corridor toward the bridge. Kepler was at the NAV console when Van Cliff arrived, running the pre-jump checklist that his navigation officer, a spare and methodical woman named Svensson, was reading to him from a secondary panel. The bridge was small and efficient and smelled slightly more of coffee than the rest of the ship because Kepler drank it continuously throughout his watch hours. There was a jacket hanging over the captain's chair that Kepler had been wearing every day since month 3, when the ship's thermal systems had developed an intermittent cold spot issue in the bridge section. The jacket had a small tear at the left shoulder seam that Kepler had never repaired, which Van Cliff had noticed in month 4, and which continued to bother him in a small, persistent, professional way. Van Cliff. Kepler did not look up from the checklist. Reyes said you had something. I need to show you the scan results. Reyes already briefed me. Dark matter in regular intervals. We're logging it as an anomalous reading and including it in the departure report. Van Cliff set his tablet on the NAV console. Kepler looked at it. I need you to see the gradient analysis, Van Cliff said. Kepler looked at the gradient analysis. Svensson stopped reading the checklist. The bridge was quiet except for the hum. This says we can't leave, Kepler said. His thumb had found the torn seam at his jacket's left shoulder and was working at it, unconsciously, the way a person worries a loose thread when their hands need something to do. Not through the lines. Yes. Van Cliff watched the navigation monitor's amber readout reflect in Kepler's eyes, 2 small grids of light sitting inside the larger dark of his face. That's not physically possible. I know. Dark matter doesn't form gravitational barriers. Under normal distribution conditions, no. This is not normal distribution. The silence that followed settled into the bridge the way cold settled into a room after a door was left open, gradually, completely, from every direction at once. Kepler leaned back in his chair and looked at Van Cliff the way people looked at Van Cliff when they had decided to be patient with him rather than immediately dismissive, which was a look he was very familiar with. Kepler was a careful man and a competent captain. He had brought the Palamede through 11 months of deep void operation without incident, and he was not reckless. He was also, Van Cliff recognized, someone who had been told that this mission was routine, and routine was the category his entire operational framework was built to serve. Show me, Kepler said. Van Cliff spent 40 minutes walking Kepler and Svensson through the data. He was thorough and precise, and he did not simplify anything that he did not need to simplify. Kepler asked good questions. Svensson asked better ones. By the end of it, Svensson had taken her hands off the navigation grid entirely and placed them flat on her thighs, as if she had decided she no longer needed to be touching anything that pointed toward the outside. Kepler was looking at the display without speaking, which was the look of someone watching a countdown reach zero. Nobody moved to ask the obvious question because the obvious question had already been answered. If the gradient analysis is correct, Svensson said finally, we'd need approximately 14 times our maximum drive output to overcome the inward gravitational bias, Van Cliff said. I've already run the thrust calculation. There's no drive technology that produces that output, Kapler said. No. The bridge was quiet. What about going around? Svensson said. The cell dimensions are approximately 7.3 light-years on each edge. At our maximum sublight speed, navigation to the nearest intersection point would take years, Kapler said. 14 years to the nearest edge point. Longer to find a gap, if gaps exist. Kapler stood up and walked to the observation port at the front of the bridge. Outside was the void, dark and absolute. Van Cliff watched him stand there and understood what he was looking at. Nothing. The same nothing that had been outside every port for 11 months. Only it was not nothing anymore. Or rather, it was a specific kind of nothing that had a name now, which was cell. Kapler's reflection showed faintly in the port glass, superimposed on the dark, and for a moment Van Cliff could see both things simultaneously. The captain's face and the void behind it, the human and the inhuman, occupying the same visual space. Our communication arrays, Kapler said without turning around. Can we transmit through the lines? Transmissions sent toward the lines become incoherent before they reach the boundary. The gradient disperses signal propagation. So we can't call for help. No. And we can't leave. Not through the lines. No. Kapler turned around. His face was controlled in the way that experienced officers' faces were controlled, which meant that the control itself was visible. Go back to the analytics bay, he said to Van Cliff. Keep working. I want options. There are no options, Kapler said again. That's an order. Van Cliff went back to the analytics bay. He was not surprised by the order. He had been ordered to find options that did not exist before. The appropriate response was to document the impossibility with sufficient thoroughness that the record would be unambiguous. He sat down at his console and began building the comprehensive data package that would accompany whatever transmission they eventually attempted, even if transmission was functionally impossible, because the work itself was the point and because doing the work was the only way he knew how to be in a situation that had no correct response. He worked for 3 hours. The analytics bay had a particular quality of stillness during long work sessions that Van Cliff had learned to appreciate. The blue display light was cold and consistent. The console keyboard produced a very slight tactile resistance that he had calibrated to his preference in month 1 and which had remained exactly right through 11 months of daily use. These were small things. He had found, over years of assignments in remote locations, that small things were what remained when larger structures failed. The keyboard resistance. The cup aligned with the panel edge. The filtration hum. At some point Dr. Reyes came in with fresh coffee and set it on the corner of his console and left without saying anything. He aligned the cup with the panel edge and drank it while he worked. At some point Ensign Morrow looked in from the doorway and said something about dinner, and Van Cliff said he would be there in an hour and was not, and nobody came back to check. The dead man's breath hummed. Van Cliff was deep in the gradient tensor analysis when the anomaly in his timestamp log caught his eye. It should not have caught his eye because it was small, smaller than anything his colleagues would have flagged, smaller than anything his review boards had considered worth examining. But Van Cliff's entire professional history was a testament to the fact that small anomalies were precisely the ones worth examining. The small ones were the ones that implied large things. The large things were always there. The small anomalies were simply where they showed. He pulled up the communications and systems log. The Palamede's internal chronometry operated on a quantum-entangled reference signal that was, in normal circumstances, perfectly stable. It was not linked to any external time source. Deep void operations precluded that, but the internal consistency of the system was absolute by design. Any deviation in the signal timing indicated hardware degradation and was flagged automatically as a maintenance concern. The log showed a recurring maintenance flag. Every 44 minutes, the ship's internal signal experienced a delay of exactly 0.002 seconds. Van Cliff looked at this for a long time. He had seen this flag before. Kepler had shown it to him in the third month of the mission when Van Cliff had asked about it, and Kepler had explained that the quantum processor was aging and that the delay was a known degradation artifact that the manufacturer had documented and that it was not operationally significant. Van Cliff had accepted this explanation because it was reasonable and because Kepler was generally reliable about mechanical matters. He had noted it in his personal log as a closed item. He had not thought about it since. He pulled up the maintenance flag data for the entire 11-month mission. The delay was present in every log entry from day one. The quantum processor had been showing this artifact since before they left the transit point, since before any detectable degradation would have been possible in a new component. The interval was also perfectly consistent, 44 minutes to the second, never varying, never drifting in the way that genuine mechanical degradation always drifted. Not degradation, something else. Van Cliff opened a new calculation window and pulled the geometric parameters of the grid structure from the dark matter scan. He had the cell dimensions, 7.3 light-years per edge. He had the line thickness, approximately 4,200 light-years. He set up a simple relative motion model and started calculating. If something moved along the outside of the grid lines, something with sufficient mass to generate gravitational effects through 4,200 light-years of dense dark matter structure, how often would it pass close enough to their cell to produce a measurable time dilation effect inside? He thought about what mass would need to be to punch that signal through that much compressed matter. He did not think about what kind of object possessed that mass, because that was a second question and he was not finished with the first one. He ran the calculation. He checked the result. He ran it again with different assumed mass parameters. The interval varied based on assumed velocity and mass, but within a physically reasonable range for the most massive objects Van Cliff could conceptualize, objects larger than anything in the known human catalog of astronomical phenomena. The interval clustered between 38 and 47 minutes. The center of that range was 42.5 minutes. The ship's signal delay occurred every 44 minutes. Van Cliff sat very still. The delay was not degradation. The delay was a shadow. Every 44 minutes, something moved past the outside of their cell, something so massive that its gravitational field distorted the passage of time inside the cell, even through walls composed of thousands of light-years of compressed dark matter. The ship's quantum reference signal, precise to fractions of a nanosecond, detected the wavefront of that distortion and logged it as a timing error. It was not a timing error. It was a footstep. He looked at the display showing the grid structure and thought about what it meant to understand what you were looking at after you had already been inside it for 11 months. He thought about the review boards and the reassignments and the career-ending reputation for finding things that inconvenienced official models. He thought about the other anomalies, the 47 flags he had logged in official maps over 3 years of fieldwork, each one dismissed, each one real. He pulled up the complete set of flagged anomaly coordinates on a separate display and plotted them against a standard cosmological map. Each anomaly was located at or near a major galactic structure: the Milky Way, Andromeda, the Virgo cluster, every major concentration of matter in the observable universe. He had always assumed a coincidence of measurement bias, that he was more likely to flag anomalies near major structures because major structures were where more measurements were taken. He had noted this assumption as a potential confound in his anomaly reports. The review boards had agreed with this interpretation and used it as grounds for dismissal. He zoomed out. The cosmological map at maximum scale showed the large-scale structure of the observable universe: galaxy filaments, galactic walls, enormous supervoids between them. The standard model described this structure as the natural product of quantum fluctuations in the early universe, amplified by gravity over billions of years into the web-like pattern that every cosmology textbook featured in its opening chapter. Van Cliff had taught himself this pattern in his first year of study. He had memorized it the way you memorized a language, until it became the native structure of his visual thinking. He looked at this pattern now with the grid overlay active. The filaments of the large-scale structure, the great walls of galaxies, the connecting threads between galaxy clusters, they followed the grid lines. Not approximately, not in some vague, metaphorical sense that a determined pattern finder could impose on noise. They followed the grid lines the way water follows channels cut for it, the way roots follow cracks in rock, the way any substance follows the path of least resistance through a structure that has been designed to direct it. The visible universe, with its billions of stars and its hundreds of billions of galaxies and its 13.8 billion years of history, was not distributed randomly throughout space. It was distributed along the walls between cells. The stars were not scattered through the universe. They were concentrated in the boundaries, in the walls, in the lines. Van Cliff reached out and pressed one trembling finger against the display glass, tracing the blue pixelated arc of a galaxy cluster superimposed over the grid line. The glass was cold. His fingertip left a smear on the rendering. The cells were empty. The cells were always empty. The cells were kept empty. He tried to swallow. His throat was completely dry. The dead man's breath hummed in his ears, and for the first time in 11 months, he heard it differently. Not a countdown that was not counting down, but a lock, turning steadily in a door he had never thought to look for. The Boötes void was not a cosmological anomaly. It was the visible interior of a standard cell. Every major void in the observable universe, the Boötes, the giant void, the KBC supervoid, the dozens of other enormous empty regions that cosmologists had spent decades trying to explain within the standard model. Each of them was the interior of a cell. And every galaxy, every filament, every concentrated structure of matter that humans had ever pointed a telescope at and called home was a wall. The most glittering, life-sustaining, history-bearing material in the universe was infrastructure. Van Cliff stood up. He did not remember deciding to stand. His legs had simply made a decision independently of whatever was happening in his head. The dead man's breath hummed. He walked to the observation slit and looked out at the void. Absolutely dark. No stars in any direction within the range of the naked eye or the ship's visual sensors. Just the dark, which was not empty. He knew that now. He had known it for hours in a technical sense. But knowing something technically and understanding what it means are different processes, and they do not always complete at the same time. Outside was not the interior of an anomaly or the center of a cosmological curiosity. Outside was the interior of a room that was 7.3 light-years wide and built from matter that had no natural analog in any physical model, and that had been here before humanity developed the ability to look up. He thought about what kind of structure required cells. He thought about what cells were for. He thought about the scale. Each cell 7.3 light-years on a side, and the Boötes void extended for 330 million light-years across, which meant the void was not one cell, but millions of cells organized into a larger unit, which implied a hierarchy, which implied design, which implied something that had built this and maintained it, and used it for purposes that Van Cliff did not have a framework to approach. He tried to think toward those purposes and found that his mind slid away from them the way a hand slides away from a wet surface. The shape of the idea was there, but the grip was not. He thought about the 44-minute interval and the shadows that caused it. He thought about what moved along the outside of cells. He thought about what kind of entity would move along the outside of cells that contained things. He walked back to his console and sat down and began documenting everything in the most precise and organized format he could manage. He used the hierarchical data structure he had developed for the anomaly reports. He included every calculation with its full methodology, every data source, every verification step. He included the communications log with the timing anomalies highlighted and the mass model that explained them. He included the gradient analysis and the transit impossibility calculations. He included the cosmological pattern overlay that showed galactic structure following the grid lines, with a correlation coefficient that made the null hypothesis of coincidence statistically incomprehensible. He organized it into sections. He labeled each section. He checked the labels for consistency. He cross-referenced the internal citations. He formatted the appendices. He wrote an abstract that was 3 sentences long and contained no qualifications because qualifications implied that the data required them, and it did not. It took 4 hours and 20 minutes. By the time he finished, the ship's chronometer read 0811. Through the observation slit, the void looked exactly the same as it had at 0347. It would always look exactly the same. That was part of the design. Consistency was a feature of enclosures. He sent the complete data package to Kepler's personal queue with a message that said, "Full analysis complete. No exit options through the grid boundaries. Recommend review of the timing log section before making drive decisions." The drive preheating sequence initiated 11 minutes later. Van Cliff had not heard anyone on the bridge discuss it. He felt it first through the soles of his feet, a low vibration in the deck plating, purposeful and building. It told him everything he needed to know about whether Kepler had read the timing log section, or whether he had read it and decided that the crew deserved to try regardless. He thought about the 44-minute interval. He checked his console clock. Last shadow passage, 12 minutes ago. 32 minutes until the next one. He picked up his coffee cup. Cold again. He set it back on the corner of the panel and aligned it with the edge. The vibration reached the console. The surface of the coffee trembled. Small concentric rings spread outward from the center of the cup and met the porcelain walls and reflected back inward and crossed each other in patterns that collapsed back to stillness and then reformed as the vibration continued, the rings moving outward and hitting the boundary and returning and hitting each other and never escaping, never making it past the rim of the cup, contained entirely within the small white circle of porcelain, no matter how many times they spread and tried. Van Cliff watched the rings. He thought about the shapes that moved outside in 44-minute intervals, and about what moved along the outside of cells that contained things, and about billions of galaxies strung along the walls like lights on a fence, while everything inside stayed dark and ordered and still. He thought about the story his civilization had told itself. Quantum fluctuations, gravitational accretion, billions of years of unguided process. The physics were accurate. The story was only wrong about the author. He sat with his hands flat on the panel, feeling the vibration move through his palms, and he closed his eyes. In the dark behind his eyelids, the dead man's breath hummed beneath the drive's sound, steady and constant, keeping the air clean and the crew alive for as long as its systems held. And then, outside the hull, in the dark that had no stars and no bottom and no exit, something heavy moved past the bars again.